Welcome back to this special hour-long edition of Inside Stories, Search for Solutions. We still don't know much about the shooter, Adam Lanza, but most experts agree it is likely that he had some kind of mental health problem. It begs the question, could this have been prevented? And are there enough resources to help people with mental illness? Here is Action News health reporter and registered nurse Allie Gorman.
I met with Dr. Anthony Rothstein, professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Penn Medicine. He says while great strides have been made in understanding the science behind mental illness, there is still a huge gap in getting people help. One reason is insurance coverage.
Most people even with good health insurance often don't have the kind of coverage they need if they do have serious mental illness.
Plus, he says the system is in disarray.
It's underfunded. It's being cut as we speak. I'm very, very worried that while I think the incidence of mental illness is going up, I don't think we're keeping up in terms of the resources we need to get the job done.
Also, a huge barrier is that some people with mental illness don't want help.
They're paranoid. They're afraid of what's going to happen.
And in most states, anyone 18 or older can't be forced into treatment. They have to consent. Most serious mental health problems, such as schizophrenia, tend to peak in early adulthood. We don't know what happened with Adam Lanza, but he and past gunmen, such as the man accused in the Aurora movie theater shooting, or the man who injured Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and killed 6 others in Arizona, were all between the ages of 20 and 25 years old. Still, Dr. Rothstein cautions not everyone with serious mental illness is violent. In fact, he says most are not, but all do need help. And he says we as a nation need a better way to recognize and treat mental illness early. I'm Allie Gorman for Inside Story.
We have several people in the mental health profession here this morning. Frank Farley, a Temple University psychologist and former president of the Psychological Association. Dr. Anthony Rothstein, a psychiatrist from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. R.G. Allen, a relationship and family therapist and director of clinical training at Drexel University, and former Philadelphia Common Pleas Court Judge and now CEO of the American Red Cross of Southeastern Pennsylvania, Renee Cardwell Hughes, Judge. Dr. Rothstein, have you ever been engaged in therapy with an individual whom you thought might blow up a school and felt compelled to do something about that?
Well, I've had patients in therapy who've expressed wishes to harm others, and when I've thought that that threat was serious, I've had to commit them against their will to treatment, to inpatient treatment. Luckily, they responded to that type of care. And most of us think that this young man, had he been in treatment, and I don't believe he was in treatment, we might have been able to avoid this terrible, terrible tragedy, because it turns out that treatment can reduce the kinds of acting out violent episodes that we see in people who are either delusional or in some other way unable to restrain themselves from acting on a hateful and destructive kind of impulse. But yes, I've had people in my practice, and ultimately it's a judgment call. You know, we try our best to, on the one hand, protect the individual who needs our treatment, but also we have to protect those around him or her who are at risk.
When we talk about spree shooters, mass murderers, is there a profile that seems to hold true in most cases?
We actually used to think there was a profile, but the more we learn, the more we know that we don't know. And there isn't a profile. Anyone could be a spree shooter. Anyone could become a serial killer. And when I say anyone, I mean a person who has a mental health defect, not a normal, healthy person. But people kill for an array of reasons. People kill for greed. People kill for power. Clearly people kill out of a mental health dysfunction. And so you never know what drives a person to do this type of thing, but there is not a profile. If you think back to John Muhammad and John Lee Boyd, prior to that, people would always say that African Americans weren't spree shooters, that they weren't serial killers. So their stereotypes are meant to be broken, even in this arena.
When you look at school shootings, and there have been tragically far too many of those, it's tempting to think that the shooters have been bullied. Do you think that's the case more often than not? And I read something that really struck a chord with me, that they're not loners as everybody says they are. They're failed joiners, that they've had so much trouble finding their group and they have felt persecuted and bullied. What do you think?
My view of this whole thing is something like this. It's a recipe. If you're looking for causes and motives and so on, there is no one motive. There is no one consistent motive, not even two consistent motives across these. We need to think of these things as a recipe where the ingredients can vary slightly from one to the next to the next. And that's what we've got to get to the bottom of. What's the recipe? What are the most important salient ingredients in the recipe? So for example, on bullying, in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. There's no evidence. But I'd like to say something else. This case is so heinous, so extreme, that frankly, many of our existing models and theories and assessments in the fields of psychology and psychiatry don't apply, because our systems have not been based on these kind of cases. Most of these cases end up suicide, or killed by cops, or executed by state, and we never get to them. For example, I was a professor at Madison, Wisconsin for several years, and Jeffrey Dahmer was incarcerated just a few miles away. Right. I couldn't get to him to, you know, like to study him or anything, because he was whacked by one of his fellow prisoners.
But see, I would have to disagree with you that this is so unique. I agree with you that it is absolutely heinous, but it's not so unique. We have this. We had Virginia Tech. We had the movie theater. We have Congresswoman Gabby Gifford's situation. We've had in the last. We just had the mall. Right. We had the Sikh shooting at the temple.
And of course Columbine.
And of course Columbine. We've had a series of these. So unfortunately, this is not as atypical as it was when I was growing up. This has become a problem in America, and while some people respond to treatment, what we don't do in America is acknowledge that we have some problems and equip ourselves.
And that's what I think I want to emphasize, that point, that in the United States, right now as we speak, about 6% of our population has a serious mental disorder of some type, but only about a third of them are in treatment.
So is this
compared to Europe?
Is this a failure
2/3
of the mental health system? And I have to ask this: is this a failure of insurance companies
that's a good question.
Who, and apparently, you know, the Affordability Act may improve the situation?
Yes.
It may not, we will see. But insurance companies are known to pay for 6 sessions, 8 sessions, and then it's see you.
Let's say this, it's a failure on everyone. Right. These children are on our watch, and everyone is failing on all levels. I'm a systemic thinker. As a couple and family therapist, they pay us to think about systems. And when you think about the way in which we have looked at this, we've thought about it as an anomaly. It's no longer an anomaly. Correct. This is a tsunami. It's an epidemic. And one of the things our president said, I know you may not agree, Frank, but one of the things our president said is that we need to have as much access to mental health as we have access to firearms. Now, we're talking about firearms now, and you had the conversation a little while ago. Well, why is it that we don't have access to mental health? Some of it is insurance. Some of it is barriers. Some of it is stereotypes. There are lots of things that are barriers to good mental health treatment. And as you said, treatment works, but you got to go to treatment in order for it to work.
And I think the community's response now that we're asking these questions is a good thing to come out of the terrible tragedies, but the stigma is there. There's a lot of misinformation. People are afraid to say, oh, I'm worried about my brother or my son.
That's right.
And when they do worry, to get them the help, if they don't want to go, right now our hands are tied. Unless they're expressing the intention to harm others. You have a child at home right now who's dysfunctional, who's showing the signs of serious mental illness. If they don't want to go, there's no way right now that you can, as a parent or a friend, insist on their coming to help.
Most of these shooters, forgive me, most of these shooters plan these attacks over a period of time.
Correct.
And in most cases, they give warnings.
That's right.
To
Warning
their
signs.
peers.
That's
To
right.
their peers.
That's
right.
The peer, the 15-year-old friend says, oh, that's just him being him. He's making these goofball comments again.
But children don't live in isolation.
Yeah.
Just as this child is making known to his friends what will happen, there are signs in the family.
That's right.
But
That's
families tend to ignore it because you don't want to be the family that's got
There
the
is
problem
stigma,
child.
and there is the magic word, shame.
Right.
Correct.
Yes,
That's
embarrassment.
absolutely right.
Let me tell you the four-letter word for love when it comes to kids. It's time. You have to spend time with your children. You cannot expect to push them out the door and for the teachers or whomever else is dealing with them to spend time, because what happens when incidents happen like this is that there are always many people that say, I was worried about that kid, or I thought something was wrong, but nobody said anything. We've got to stop sitting in silence, suffering in silence, and then having our children destroyed and our families destroyed.
Stop using
we
the
cannot
criminal
have
justice
we cannot
system.
have this conversation without acknowledging that video games,
Yes.
movies, television glorify violence.
Yeah.
I'd like to
But they're
comment.
also controlled by the marketplace.
Yeah, money.
How do we deal with that?
Money.
Well, in my view, there's two types of violence, big V violence and small v violence. And all of the research on media effects, etc., are directed at small v violence. They use questionnaires as to how aggressive you feel, etc. No perpetrators of the Newtown type perpetrators has ever been studied in a context of video violence
That's
and
true.
media.
Right.
So we have to be very cautious about that. But it's one ingredient in the recipe.
He was an ardent player of video games.
Allegedly, correct.
Allegedly,
but
correct.
of course, we have a whole nation of ardent players of video
So let me
games.
tell you, the people that I work with who hopefully won't go out and take actions like this are kids who are isolated in one way or another, the failed joiners, who have poor social skills, who develop tremendous resentment or fantasies of whatever, and then they spend literally 16, 18 hours a day disconnected from humans, but only through video games or through violent kinds of encounters. And we don't know enough yet. What does that do to the brain?
Of the community.
It is. It's
That's
been
a failure
part of failure to the
because if
community.
your child is
We have 30
spending-
seconds. Going forward, how do we improve the situation?
Going forward,
how do we catch the Lonzes of the
more
world?
engaged communities,
That's
more
right.
engaged parenting.
Right.
It's
Listen,
critical.
I heard
And
something,
more
I saw
opportunities for interaction that are pro-social, and also support for those that are worried about children or young people.
Last word.
To
We've got to
get to
decrease
help.
the stigma.
Yeah.
We've got to pay attention to
That's
our
right.
children. And if you see something, say something. You say something, do something. And we've got to do it collectively.
right.
We cannot do it in isolation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. We'll be back in just a moment.